Guardianship. "Witch! The Soulton witch! We have him!" The jagged cries tore through the morning air, shattering the stillness of the chess court. Inside the cour de logis, the sound was an ugly intrusion upon a sanctuary of reason. Thomas Hill sat among his Oxford guests, the silver clinking softly against pewter as they finished a breakfast of ale and salted ham. The light from the tall windows caught the scholarly lines of Thomas's face, a face honed by the new learning of Oriel College and the quiet application of logic. His guests had been undergraduates with him at Oriel. They shared a common language of architecture and intellect, having come of age in the shadow of Christopher Wren, himself from another Mercer family like Thomas's own. They had been there in the Oriel quads when Thomas first asked for advice on stabilizing the failing pyramidal roof of Soulton Hall. Together, they had debated the design of the 1668 door case, a portal Thomas intended as a new covenant of the Restoration. He wanted the stone of the manor to banish the tumult of the Civil War and replace the lack of harmony with a classical, enduring peace. This was a domestic world, a cultivated space where the world was understood through mathematics and the classics. But outside, the 17th century was still clawing at the door with the dirty fingernails of superstition. He felt no longing for the glittering, hollow opportunities of the court in London. His family had seen enough of those machinations. They had been at the dangerous foreground of the Reformation's aftershocks, from the printing of the Matthew's Bible to the precarious legacy of old Sir Rowland. London was a place of shifting allegiances and sudden falls. Shropshire, by contrast, offered the honest gravity of his obligations. He was happier anchoring his life in the soil of his ancestors, finding satisfaction in the stewardship of his neighbours rather than in the fawning politics of the capital. Thomas felt a cold wave of distaste. He had read jurisprudence at Oriel, where he had been struck by the crystalline clarity of Justinian and the Roman law codes. That education, coupled with a deep cultural connection to Renaissance humanism, made this kind of superstition feel utterly repulsive. To him, such witch matters were not merely ignorant. They were a dirty, hysterical tool of abuse wielded by the crowd to crush the marginalized. It was unusual, however, that they had brought a lad before him rather than a woman. The Manningtree and Tendring fever of 1645, the peak of the largest witch hunt in English history, had fed on those on the fringes of society, the elderly, the widowed, the truly ostracized. Thomas was acutely aware of how Matthew Hopkins had turned Essex into a charnel house. He was determined that the rot of East Anglia would not cross into County Salop. It made the situation all the more horrifying. The madness was evolving, finding new targets in its hunger for a scapegoat. Turning to his steward, Adam, he spoke with the flat, commanding tone of a justice of the peace. "Adam, take them across to the justice room. Do not bring them through the main house. Lead them to the moot hall and tell them I shall attend when the room is prepared." He watched from the window as Adam diverted the ragged line of villagers away from the domestic heart of the manor, guiding them toward the external entrance of the judicial wing. Thomas excused himself from his guests with a weary grace. To reach the justice room, he had to leave the compact warmth of the cour de logis and step into the spaces he had specifically salvaged from the ruin of the 40s. The moot hall was his pride, a place where he had meticulously repaired the Sir Rowland chair and the heavy justice furniture to ensure that even if the palace scale of his ancestor was gone, the palace justice remained. His sense of obligation to old Sir Rowland was a heavy, constant anchor. He had seen the great man's statue in St. Stephen's, Walbrook, carrying Magna Carta aloft. Before that, and much else had been swallowed by the Great Fire of '66. How could he not have that image in mind? He remembered how Sir Rowland's library had brought both parliamentarians and royalists to Soulton in 42 and 43, both sides scouring the shelves for texts to either secure or weaponize for their causes. The Tudor Great Hall of old Sir Rowland's time had finally required major intervention these last years. While the roof had survived the Civil War, the housing of refugees following the Great Fire in Wem in 77 had been the final straw for the structure. Parts of that building had stood since long before the Tudors had even arrived, tracing back to the establishment of the base court in the early 1400s. There was a long-held recollection of manor old-timers that a pathetic, defeated Duke of Buckingham had been detained in these buildings after being discovered in a ditch at the manor's edge, held here before being taken to Salisbury for a trial far more serious and fatal than the one Thomas was to preside over today. To stabilize this ancient fabric, Thomas had replaced the failing walls with sturdy red brick and lined the chamber with large-pane wainscoting. He had chosen a sophisticated pea-leaf green paint for the wood, accented by gilded bead moulding that caught the morning light. Thomas entered the chamber through the private justice's door, stepping in beneath the shadow of the last king-post truss in the room, and onto a slight dais built over the floor. In that moment, he felt the shift of his own persona. All the world's a stage. The dignity of the law required that he leave his identity as a husband, host, and friend behind in the other building. He assumed his part with a theatrical gravity. The performance was the only thing that could stand between a vulnerable neighbor and a violent end. As he reached the chair of estate, old Sir Rowland's own chair, the mob fell silent, cowed by the geometry of the space. The chair was repaired now, and comfortable enough, but it would always show the scars and egesta of the Civil War. To Thomas, that was the point. The seat of justice had survived the fire and the sword, and it would survive this. To his left, the two only round windows acted as silent witnesses to his belief system, framing the wood the Lodge family had known before his own people arrived here. He looked up at the timber rafters, reminded of his oath. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It was a geometry of guardianship. He was not there to rule, but to protect the truth from the fire of hysteria. You bring an allegation of witchcraft, Thomas began, the weight of his office filling the room. But in this room we do not weigh shadows. We weigh evidence. For the next hour, he dismantled the miracles of Horton. He looked at the boy's sleeve, stained with the grease of the flying plough irons. He listened to the tale of the parson's vanished saddle and saw not a spirit's work, but the clumsy prank of a servant. He used the architecture of the room, the weight of the king posts and the ancestral chair, to anchor the space in reality. He resigned himself to the judicial process of some sort, knowing that a vacuum of law would only invite a lynch mob. He had sent for the priest at Wem not out of a desire for more ceremony, but from a practical, weary understanding of his own limits. Thomas knew that the work of revising these people's minds was a different craft entirely from applying the law. If he tried to be both the judge and the soul doctor, he would be taking on too many identities at once. He would lose the focus required for his part on the stage. He needed the priest to handle the heavy lifting of the villagers' consciences so he could keep the scales of justice level. They worked as a quiet team to subdue the room's fever. While Thomas applied the cold logic of the law, the priest labored to reach the parts of the crowd that logic couldn't touch, speaking to the spiritual danger of their pride and their ungodly haste to judge. The priest moved among them, challenging their witness with a steady gravity, reminding them that to bear false witness was a sin that would stain them long after this morning was over. By the time Thomas stood to dismiss them, the witch fire had been extinguished by the cold water of reason and the priest's persistent work on their hearts. The lad of Horton would live, a grim contrast to the many souls lost to similar delusions in the East. Epilogue. This narrative approaches history through a fictionalized lens, helping the reader to unlock and navigate moments that might otherwise remain dry or distant. While the specific dialogues and interior thoughts are dramatic representations, everything here, from fact to fiction, is built upon the foundation of sourced matters. It is a plausible reconstruction, intended to explore the pressures and motivations of these figures. As a work of narrative, it does not claim to be a definitive historical record or a precise account of every thought and action, but rather a way to ground historical possibilities in a human context. I am deeply grateful for the scholarly support and consultation provided by Birger Genicht, who helped reconstruct the way the spaces of Soulton Hall were articulated during their 17th century phase.